If you're after a smartphone with a camera that isn't total trouser, well, don't feel like you absolutely have to spunk out $1,000 or more on some of the latest, snazziest flagships. Because in 2025 there are shagloads of decent mid-range mobiles that are perfectly capable of snapping great looking pics of your fluffy pals or whatever food you're about to stuff into your face. You can then share with the world so friends and complete strangers will think your life is absolutely awesome. Your Uncle Spurt makes it his solemn duty to review as many of these mid-range smartphones as possible. So here's my favourites right now for their camera smarts. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, please do poke subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! Now first up, one of my favourite mid-range smartphones in 2025 is still Google's Pixel 8a. It may be almost 9 months old now, which is positively geriatric in smartphone time, but I love almost everything about it. From the lovable stock Android experience and 6 more years of guaranteed support, to the gorgeous OLED screen and respectable battery life. But as usual, it's Google's camera tech that really stands out here on the Pixel 8a, even if quite a lot of the hardware has actually been recycled from the even more ancient Pixel 7a. With that same 64 meg quad PD wide sensor and an obligatory ultra wide, of course. That camera app is once again a breeze to use, nice and tidy and streamlined. You can zip between all of the different modes with a quick flick of your finger down here, and there's not too many. And you can quickly and easily swap between photo and video with a quick poke down here. And as usual, the joy of the Pixel 8a is its point and shoot simplicity, but if you do want a bit of control over your shot, you can tweak the brightness, the shadows, the good old white balance. But like the regular Pixel 8, you miss out on those pro features like the high-res shooting and the raw image capture. Now the main difference I found between the Pixel 8a and the Pixel 8 is that the focus here sometimes struggles with up-close subjects, something that you rarely see on those flagships. But besides that wee gripe, the Pixel 8 performs admirably no matter the environmental conditions. Certainly doesn't fill its trousers at the slightest bit of HDR or low light conditions either. All kinds of tricky lighting ably handled by this thing. And in fact, in low light conditions, the Pixel 8a is an improvement over the old 7a, as you've now got a longer exposure night mode. So at night time you can expect nice crisp results without too much grain creeping in and ruining the party. So one thing's for sure, the Pixel 8a is one of the best smartphone snappers at this sort of price point, especially if you're trying to capture living subjects like cats and kids. It pretty much nails those shots every time with very little blur unless the lighting is a bit cack. And besides that 64 meg primary shooter, you've also got a more basic 13 meg ultra wide angle snapper. And this produces acceptable photos if you just want to cram lots into that frame, get a more dramatic angle or whatever. But like the Pixel 8 and pretty much all mid-range mobiles, there is no telephoto shooter, so if you are zooming in, it's just a digital crop using that primary lens. And you don't want to zoom in too far, otherwise things get rather murky rather fast, and it maxes out at 8 times digital zoom anyway. And then up front you've got a 13 meg fixed focus selfie cam, and while it's nothing special, it's certainly an improvement on some previous Pixels, again dealing fairly acceptably with strong backlighting and offering a decent portrait mode. And as if the photo taking abilities weren't already fantastic, you've also got some excellent editing tools here on the Pixel 8a. The best one being the Magic Editor, which just allows you to select a subject and then either move them about in the frame so we can get all nice and cozy, or you can get really freaky and resize stuff. Is it a monster cat or is it just really close to the camera lens? And Google's best shot mode as well, which you've probably seen advertised on telly if you've turned on your TV in the past 6 months or so. It's also an absolute cracker if you've got kids. And as for the video chops of the Pixel 8a, well, no real complaints there either. You can shoot up to 4K Ultra HD resolution footage, and it all looks nice and crisp, reasonable color reproduction on it, respectable image stabilization if you're moving around and shooting at the same time, and the dual mic setup means that the audio capture is just as good too. But any video shot in lower light, definitely about as visually appealing as James Corden's jockstrap. We're talking grainy, murky, nasty looking footage, so definitely just avoid all of that. You certainly don't get the video boost feature that you get on that Pixel 8 Pro. And like the Pixel 8 flagships, you've also got that excellent audio eraser tool, so you can dial down any unfortunate wind noises or background crowd shindiggery, so any vocals and the like shine right through. Another decent choice is the Nothing Phone 2A, which may be a bit of a brick, but it sure does stand out from the crowd with its spangly disco arse and undeniably unique launcher. For this price, the performance is stunning, serving up a smooth slice of Genshin action even on the highest graphics settings. Plus, that battery life is proper impressive too. Overall, there's not a lot not to like. And the camera, while certainly not flawless, is dependable enough for everyday shooting, while also creepily looking like the cold dead eyes of one of them minion things. And what you got here is a dual lens setup. That primary shooter is a Samsung GN9 sensor with optical image stabilization built in. And by default, this captures photos at 12 megapixels. You can boost up to 50 megs if you want. And I was generally quite happy with my test shots. You do see some saturation in brighter light, but colours otherwise appear quite close to what you'll see with your peepers. And in tricky contrast, you do have Nothing's new Ultra XDR mode for the ultimate HDR shots. This captures 8 pics at different dynamic levels, then combines them into a tasty HDR pie. So even if you're basically shooting into the light, you'll get similar results to an iPhone. It's not a natural looking pic, but those darker areas are brightly reproduced, while lighter elements aren't too blown out. Now, shooting living subjects can be slightly more complicated in ambient light. As usual with mid-range phones, you'll get blurred results if the buggers won't stay still. But in better light, the Nothing Phone 2A is a pleasingly nippy snapper. These shots are taken at the 1x zoom level with that Ultra XDR mode active, and these right here are taken at 2x zoom again with XDR. The portrait mode is generally reliable for adding some bokeh style smudging if you're into all of that. And while there's no dedicated night mode, the Nothing Phone 2A can prolong the exposure in low light to brighten things up. So you'll get crispy detail and again pretty good tones as long as your hands are still. Alternatively, those glyph lights also work in a pinch as a funky sort of flash for night shots. As for the second lens slapped on the back, well, that is an ultra-wide angle affair using Samsung's GN1 sensor, I believe it is. Although despite sticking with Samsung for both sensors, the ultra-wide does still produce warmer tones. It's alright, pretty much standard fare at this price. And then for your video type shenanigans, where you can shoot at 1080p full HD, otherwise 4K at 30 frames per second. You can bump up to 60 frames per second at Ultra HD though. And for the majority of my test video, the Nothing Phone 2A did its job. The focus is pretty fast to react to sudden changes, those visuals are detailed enough to look good on a big screen, the audio is generally captured cleanly in the immediate surroundings, things only really get muddy at a distance or when there's a lot of random environmental noise. That stabilization doesn't give the most natural vibe, but it is good at smoothing out your footage when you're moving and shooting. I did experience a couple of little issues though, including some short juddery spells when shooting at 4K, which I'm hoping will be blasted by the next camera update. And then for all of your selfie shenanigans, you've got a 32 megapixel front facing snapper here on the Nothing Phone 2A. I believe it's the exact same tech as the Nothing Phone 2. And this does a perfectly decent job. You've got natural looking snaps with all of those lovely crease lines captured in perfect detail in brighter light. At least things get a bit softer in ambient light. Plus, of course, a reliable portrait mode to wipe out all of those weird background lurkers. And if you want to shoot yourself a bit of video using that selfie cam, well, it maxes out at full HD, sadly no 4K option here. But again, the Nothing Phone 2A seems to do the job perfectly for Skype and Zoom and all that kind of stuff. Mike's doing a decent job of picking up your voice even at a distance. However, bear in mind that the Nothing Phone 3A is just around the corner. That is set to launch at the beginning of March 2025. So if you can hang on a wee bit longer, might find that that one's got a bit of an upgrade to the optics. So now let's take a squint at Samsung and its Galaxy A55 mid-ranger, which looks not too dissimilar to the S25, but thankfully won't molest your wallet quite so violently. You won't find a Snapdragon 8 Elite stuffed in here, of course, and Samsung's own Exynos 1480 certainly struggles with memory guzzling games at times. But this sleek-looking smartphone boasts a water and scratch-resistant design, micro SD and eSIM support, a knee-trembling AMOLED screen, and of course some respectable mid-range camera action. And what you've got here is a 50 megapixel primary sensor. You can shoot in 12 megapixel images by default using pixel binning, or you can bump that up to full 50 megs. You've also got a 12 megapixel ultra-wide angle shooter, and that final snapper as usual, pointless 5 megapixel macro bollocks. Now, one of my biggest beefs with the old A54 was the fact that the shutter speed was a bit crap on it, frankly. However, this seems to have improved for the A55 to the point where it only slows down if you're like rapidly shooting portrait shots. And if you've used any Samsung smartphone in recent times, you'll know all of the standard camera fare that is stashed on here. You got your food mode for snapping your sarnies and bunging them on Instagram. You got your night mode, you got your pro mode. And this doesn't have a built-in RAW option, but you can play around with the likes of the ISO levels, the EV, etc. You've got that obligatory fun mode, which is so much fun that frankly I might just die. Or at the very least, kill myself. I don't hate fun, I swear to God, I just hate this. And anyway, I've spent 4 days now wandering about the place with the Galaxy A55, shooting random stuff, using my limited photographic abilities, and here's just a few sample shots. The Galaxy A55 is unsurprisingly very similar to the A54, a dependable snapper in most conditions, producing slightly poppier, more obviously processed pics versus the Pixel 7a. I did get some blurry shots when snapping living subjects, but the A55 can handle ropey lighting fairly well. You'll get softer photos in ambient light, but you do have that dedicated night mode for low light shots, as long as you can keep your hands relatively still for a few seconds. Oh, and I wouldn't zoom in beyond 2 times because the digital crop renders everything fuzzy. You can also shoot a good bit of home movie action here on the A55. It does top off at 4K at 30 frames per second. There's no 60 FPS option, not unless you dial it down to full HD resolution. And as usual with Samsung blows, the video results are pretty bloody good. At 4K level, plenty of detail packed into every frame. The stabilization is excellent. And the built-in mics do a good job of picking up audio from all around you without too much background interference. The main issue when shooting video is that switching between the main and the ultra-wide lenses is a rather jarring experience. Not exactly the smoothest of transitions, but besides all that, it's all good. And then finally, around the front end of the Galaxy A55 is a 32 megapixel selfie shooter. As usual, you've got the wide and ultra-wide options. Ooh. And as if you weren't already completely sick of staring at my bald head, well, here's a few more instances of it. And you can actually shoot 4K video using that selfie shooter as well, again at 30 frames per second, otherwise full HD at 60 frames per second. And again, the mics are good enough to pick up your voice, no real issues there. And Samsung also offers up the slightly cheaper Galaxy A35 if your budget happens to be tighter than a starfish's sphincter. The A35 is another water-resistant blower with a 120Hz AMOLED screen, stereo speakers, fantastic battery life, and yes, the same occasionally shonky performance. But the camera setup is again quite flexible and mostly dependable, especially considering the price. Samsung has slapped on a triple lens setup headlined by a 50 megapixel primary shooter with optical image stabilization. And this captures 12 meg photos by default. You can bump up to the maximum 50 meg resolution if the conditions are really good, with a quick poke up here. And I gotta say, I'm impressed by the images that the Galaxy A35 5G has spaffed out these last few days. It's a capable, dependable wee snapper, even when the conditions are a bit arse. So for instance, HDR situations with strong contrast, a lot of harsh backlight and stuff like that. Generally, this phone copes admirably, even on auto mode. Same goes for lower light conditions as well. You still get some pretty rich tones seeping through. And overall, Samsung seems to have calmed things down a bit when it comes to the processing, so your images look reasonably natural. And naturally, you've got the full complement of bonus Samsung modes as well. So you've got a portrait mode, which adds a nice bokeh style effect to your photo. You can tweak this after you've taken the shot. You've got a food mode if you want to take a picture of your scran before you shovel it down your throat. Night mode just to boost the brightness of those low light shots, as long as you can keep your hand and your subject really still. And good old single take as well, which is particularly good if you've got cats, kids, something that moves around a lot. And a dedicated pro mode as well, where you can mess around with the likes of the shutter speed, ISO levels, white balance, etc. Although there's no direct support for RAW capture in this pro mode. And yeah, they've chucked in the fun mode as well for really fun people like myself to take fun photos like this. And you've also got yourself an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter and a 5 megapixel macro lens. And the Galaxy A35 doesn't fall on its arse when you have to shoot a bit of home movie action either. You can capture 30 or 60 frames per second footage at full HD resolution, but if you boost up to 4K Ultra HD, as you can see there, maxes out at 30 FPS. I shot all of this test footage at the 4K resolution at 30 FPS, and stabilization was good enough so it didn't look all jerky and shonky. Detail levels are respectable. At night time, it does an alright job as well. Doesn't absolutely cack itself in low light. And that audio pickup's pretty good as well, as long as things aren't too gusty and the background noise isn't too troublesome. And then last up, there's that 13 megapixel selfie shooter. And thankfully this doesn't capture too much detail, not every single wrinkle and sag and such forth. Can cope with a reasonably respectable range of conditions similar to that rear shooter. And yay, verily, you can shoot up to 4K resolution footage using that selfie shooter. Again, the audio pickup is respectable, and yeah. Now, I'm a big fan of the OnePlus 13, but let's face it, it ain't quite as affordable as some of those classic back in the day OnePlus blowers. If you can't quite afford a OnePlus 13, well, maybe have a gander at the OnePlus 13R instead, which lops off some of the shinier, fancier bits for a more affordable asking price. You've still got yourself a massive battery that fills up quicker than a portable piss cabin at a music festival, powerful Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 performance for your gaming needs, and the same excellent Oxygen OS 15 experience. And sadly, that camera hardware from the OnePlus 13 has also been completely stripped out and replaced here on the OnePlus 13R, so it can't quite offer the same super flexible, super dependable experience as the flagship. And while you've got a similar setup in terms of telephoto shooter, ultra-wide-angle shooter, etc., it is very different camera hardware on this pair. So for instance, the primary shooter, 50 megapixel on both, but it is Sony's LYT 700 sensor here on the OnePlus 13R versus the 808 on the OnePlus 13. And likewise for that telephoto shooter on the OnePlus 13, they stuck with the Sony sensor LYT 600 with 3 times optical zoom, whereas on the OnePlus 13R that swapped out for a Samsung JN5 sensor with a mere 2 times optical zoom. The OnePlus 13R actually used that Samsung JN5 sensor for the ultra-wide-angle shooter. It's a 50 meg sensor, so you can get some pretty detailed macro and ultra-wide snaps. Whereas on the OnePlus 13R, you just got yourself a basic 8 megapixel effort, which is kind of just there if you need it, I guess. Now the actual camera modes and features pretty similar on both of these smartphones, but as you can see you've got a dedicated macro shot mode here on the regular OnePlus 13 flagship, which you don't get on the OnePlus 13R. While the OnePlus 13 flagship also serves up a dedicated action mode, and it's definitely better at shooting living, moving subjects, kids, cats, etc. compared with the 13R. And while the flagship phone has that Hasselblad Master mode, complete with a bit of vignette action, you can mess around with the sharpness level, etc. You've got a more regular Pro mode here on the OnePlus 13R, but it still allows you to fiddle around with all the main stuff, the ISO levels, the white balance, etc. And once again, you can capture raw images. And the OnePlus 13 is certainly superior in some situations. The 13R struggles more in high contrast scenarios, with detail often lost and colours occasionally appearing saturated, while it also isn't as good for those up-close macro shenanigans, or of course those action snaps. But hey, if the lighting's decent, you'll still usually get a crispy pic, and while the telephoto camera can't zoom as far, it's still a useful addition. For your home movie needs, you can capture 4K resolution footage at up to 60 frames per second on the OnePlus 13R, just like the OnePlus 13, although sadly no Dolby Vision smarts. But hey, I still found that the video I shot on the OnePlus 13R looked pretty slick. Things don't get too soft or grainy when the lighting conditions aren't ideal. That audio capture absolutely fantastic from all directions as well. Now the OnePlus 13 flagship sports a 32 megapixel selfie shoot, and you can once again shoot 4K resolution footage at 60 frames per second with Dolby Vision support. Very swanky pants indeed. With the OnePlus 13R, it is a slightly more pared back 16 megapixel selfie shooter. And no, you don't have those 4K 60 FPS smarts. Unfortunately, this tops off at full HD, and yeah, no Dolby Vision action on here at all. But you do have a triple mic setup, so the audio capture just as clear as with the OnePlus 13 flagship phone. And the likes of stabilization and everything absolutely fine as well. And frankly, when you're shooting a mug like mine, I probably prefer full HD to 4K. And hey, if you don't have quite enough funds for the OnePlus 13R, well, no worries, OnePlus has you pretty much covered at any price point. And definitely check out the OnePlus Nord 4 for instance, one of the best mid-range phones from the past few months, sporting a full metal jacket that makes me long for the heady days of HTC and LG flagships. It's a 6.74-inch beast boasting excellent hardware and a lovable bit of Oxygen OS, complete with some decent gaming features. So it's just as well then that the Nord 4 can cope with some hardcore Genshin or Wuthering Waves action. Adds in a great bit of battery life and the stupidly quick 100-watt fast charging, and there's plenty to recommend the OnePlus Nord 4 before you even get onto the camera tech. And that primary shooter is a 50 meg Sony LYT600 sensor, as also slapped on the cheaper OnePlus Nord CE4 Lite and the Oppo Reno 12 Pro, which I recently reviewed. They both landed here in Blighty just this past month or so, and I thought the camera tech was decent on those phones, and the results pumped out by the Nord 4 here are very similar, which shouldn't be an enormous surprise. The camera's fairly accurate when it comes to skin tones and other hues. I have seen the occasional wee bit of saturation here and there when the conditions are bright, but it's avoidable easily enough by taking your time and occasionally adjusting the on-screen brightness slidery thing. There's absolutely the correct technical terminology for this thing. And you do also have a dedicated Pro mode if you want to piddle around with the likes of the ISO levels or the white balance as well, get a very precise kind of shot. But for these test snaps, I just stuck with the auto mode like most people will do. Portrait shots usually look pretty good too, with a serious bit of bokeh style blurring on the default depth of field settings. You can tweak that if you want. And in Kaka lighting, the OnePlus Nord 4 thankfully doesn't trip up. You'll still get a workable amount of fine detail in there, as long as your subject doesn't bugger about and move just as you poke the shutter button. And that secondary lens slapped on the back end of the OnePlus Nord 4 is an 8 megapixel ultra-wide angle shooter, pretty standard stuff. And it's actually pretty good. Those tones aren't too twisted, the distortion is limited. Not bad at all if you want to fit more into the frame. And if you're into a bit of selfie action, well, you've got a 16 megapixel front-facing camera. And once again, those results are respectable. Even strong backlighting doesn't throw it off. Skin tone's still pretty natural, or pretty much non-existent in my case. And if you jump on into the Photos app, you've got the usual editing tools on here. You've also got an AI eraser, which of course is all the rage. Just obliterating things from existence. Let's try and get rid of some of these seagulls, for instance. Just draw over the wee buggers, and then poof, they are removed from existence. It's not quite as quick as the Google equivalent, and as you can see, they're not quite perfect all of the time, but it does a job. So we can gradually, bit at a time, remove these rats of the sky from our lovely photo. And OnePlus has promised it'll be adding more AI tools in future updates as well, including the best face one where it stops people from blinking and gurning, and a clear face one which doesn't remove zits sadly, but can sort out any focal issues. And if you want to shoot a wee bit of video, well, you can do that at Ultra HD 4K level at either 30 or 60 frames per second. And once again, I liked the results here. Shooting at that Ultra HD level, you still get some respectable image stabilization, so everything's pleasingly smooth when you are walking about the place and recording at the same time. The picture quality, absolutely fine, even in lower light, not too bad. And the audio quality is decent. Those mics can pick up voices and other shenanigans from quite a distance. And you get a wee bit of wind feedback when it's a bit blustery, but not too bad. The Nord can temper the worst of it. And if that's still just a little bit too much cash to spunk out on your next mid-range mobile, well, no worries. OnePlus also launched the even more affordable Nord CE4 Lite. And this still boasts some very impressive specs and a bright and cheery design for a proper budget price. Sadly, you do have a creaky old Snapdragon 695 chipset bunged in there, which means gamers will have to stick to lighter fare such as PUBG, or maybe the occasional heated game of Minesweeper. But battery life is excellent again, bolstered by 80-watt fast charging. The screen is another OLED corker, and you've also got yourself a decent enough dual lens camera setup. And the primary shooter here is a 50 meg Sony LYT600 sensor with optical image stabilization. And as always, OnePlus's camera app is very easy to get on with. Got a whole bunch of different camera modes to play around with, including a dedicated Pro mode, where you can mess around with the likes of the shutter speed, the ISO levels, the white balance, to get a very precise kind of shot. For these sample shots though, I just stuck with OnePlus's dedicated auto mode, so literally point and shoot, zero thought required, which suits me absolutely fine. So here's some of the pics I took over in New York when I wasn't sprinting for the nearest AC because, oh my god, it was hot enough to actually melt the pavement. And if you're looking for a bit of flexibility, you might be slightly disappointed because that secondary lens isn't an ultra-wide angle shooter or anything, it's just a basic 2 megapixel mono shooter. There's no 4K mode when it comes to shooting a video, but you can capture some perfectly crisp looking full HD footage. And again, here's just some sample video clips that I shot over in the States. Stabilization's pretty good for moving and shooting at the same time, and the audio side of things is alright as well, as long as it's not too blustery. The mics will generally pick up everything that's going on around you. And then flip around to the front and you've got yourself a 16 megapixel selfie shooter. And here's just a couple of selfies where I wasn't absolutely gushing sweat and basically turning into a human waterfall. And if you fancy a bit of stock Android action instead and you're not too put off by the slightly patchy software updating, well, Motorola is another brand well worth checking out. One of their best offerings right now is the Motorola Edge 50 Neo, which is pleasingly compact and sports a strokeably soft arse and a bright selection of colours, while also offering up full water resistance. That 6.4-inch POLED screen is pleasingly bright and poppy, while the Dimensity smarts are surprisingly good for gaming. And while the Moto Edge 50 Neo sports a dinky battery, it can still last a full day with fast wired charging on top. As for the camera tech, well, it's pretty good. Otherwise it wouldn't be in this roundup, would it? And I'm not too surprised to see Motorola stick with that 50 megapixel Sony Lite 700C camera sensor that it also stuffed inside of the Fusion. Thought this was an excellent choice because it generally pumps out some pretty good pics even in more challenging conditions. Here's just a few examples shot around the old homestead this past 24 hours. As you can see, even in low light situations, you tend to get quite bright, quite bold looking pictures. Not too much grain creeping in there. You do once again have that auto enhance feature for your HDR type situations, which helps to brighten up those darker areas and produce a more balanced pic if losing some of the sort of realism. As you can see, this has quite an impact when there is strong contrast. The Edge 50 Neo also sports a 13 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter, the same as the Fusion. And this is also used for any macro shenanigans you want to get up to. But you've also now got yourself a 10 megapixel telephoto shooter with 3 times optical zoom to get a bit closer to your subject. This does a pretty good job, as long as you're not zooming in too far, otherwise things do get a little bit quirky, shall we say, around that 30 times maximum zoom level. And of course you've got the usual Motorola bonus bits, including the portrait mode. You've got full-on pro controls as well if you want to mess around with the white balance, the ISO level, shutter speed. And if you tap your way into more, all the usual standard stuff, including spot color. Night vision is tucked away in here, but you can always customize this, drag that into the main fold, and get rid of any other bits that you don't use. And you've also got yourself that 50 meg ultra res mode if you want to shoot high resolution photos. If you want to shoot some home movies, you can capture full HD footage at 30 or 60 frames per second. Otherwise, you can bump up the resolution to 4K as long as you don't mind sticking at 30 FPS. Because otherwise that just bumps the resolution back down. And while you're shooting, even at 4K resolution, you can do a bit of zoomy zoom action, get a bit closer to your subject. The audio pickup seems pretty clean, stabilization respectable, even at 4K levels, so yeah, fine. And then last up, around front, it is your typical 32 megapixel selfie snapper, which, you know, if you actually like capturing photos of your own face, well, yeah, does a job. Now, Xiaomi is also partial to coughing out the occasional excellent mid-range camera phone, and its latest effort is the 14T. Overlook the cheap feel and plastic design and instead admire that water-resistant finish, as well as the gorgeous AMOLED screen which supports both HDR10+ and Dolby Vision shenanigans. The Xiaomi 14T's performance is also as smooth as my bonds after a hearty scrub down with a block of lard. And that's thanks to MediaTek's Dimensity 8300 Ultra, plus a sizable stainless steel vapor chamber. And when you finally do drain the 5000 mAh battery, you're refilling with the pretty nippy 67 watt hypercharge action. As for the optics, well, Xiaomi has once again collaborated with Leica, with the usual eye-pleasing results. Now that primary shooter is a Sony IMX906 sensor, 50 megapixels, again, just like the Light Fusion sensor stuffed into that Pro. And once again, quite natural looking photos spaffed out by this thing with some gorgeous crispy contrast, rather than the over brightened shenanigans you'll get from the likes of an Apple. But of course, if you do prefer those brighter, poppier snaps where you can always turn on Leica Vibrant with a quick jab of that, and this does produce more iPhone-esque results. And like its Pro sibling, you've also got a 12 megapixel ultra-wide angle shooter, and the Xiaomi 14T sports a 50 meg telephoto snapper. Although not quite as powerful as that Pro effort, this does max out at 20 times combined zoom, and as usual, you won't quite want to max it out because things get pretty fuzzy before then. You appear to have pretty much the exact same camera features and modes slapped on here as well, including a good bit of master portrait mode with the 4 focal lengths once again, so you can get it just right for your subject. And when it comes to the video chops, things again quite complex. You can't shoot 8K video here on the Xiaomi 14T, unlike the Pro, but you can capture 4K footage at 30 or 60 frames per second, unless you chuck on the HDR mode, in which case you max out at 4K 30 frames per second. And then you've also, on top of that, got the likes of the Master Cinema mode if you're shooting in more HDR type scenarios. You've also got a movie mode, where as you can see there, you can automatically focus on a subject with a double tap of them. The focus will then lock on them, even if other people are wandering in and out of frame. And as if that wasn't enough, you've also got the director mode, which is basically a completely manual mode. As you can see there, it gives you access to a whole bunch of manual controls, including ISO level, shutter speed, white balance. So you can tinker with these to your heart's content. You've also got a whole bunch of on-screen shenanigans, including a histogram. See exactly how much battery life is remaining and how much footage you can shoot before your storage fills up. And then around the front end, you've got yourself a 32 megapixel selfie shooter. And using that front-facing camera, you can record up to 4K Ultra HD resolution footage at 30 frames per second. There's no 60 FPS option here. Isn't that right, buddy? Yes, right, isn't it, buddy? And like the Pro model, the audio pickup absolutely fine when you are recording a video, but if you are shooting outdoors, you want to make sure it's not too gusty, because that wind noise does get picked up pretty badly. If you manage to actually track them down online, I'd also heartily recommend the Vivo V40 phones. And these boast the usual commanding specs for a mid-range blower, although the Pro model boosts the performance with MediaTek's capable Dimensity 9200 Plus. Perfect for a wee bit of wuthering waves on your lunch break. But as usual, it's the photography chops that particularly impress, especially here on the Vivo V40 Pro. And what you've got here is a triple 50 meg camera setup headlined by Sony's IMX921 sensor with optical image stabilization. And Vivo's camera app is rather full on. Loads of different options to mess around with, including the ability to swap between vivid, textured and Zeiss natural modes. And this does make quite a significant difference to your photo, textured in particular, highlighting whatever is central in your pic. And that's on top of all of the other filters, of course, you get slapped on here. And then, of course, as always, you've got that Aura Light flash as well, which you can manually tweak from warm to cold, like so. This is now brighter than previous generations, and it can also automatically scale from warm to cold, depending on the ambient lighting. And I found that even in quite strong lighting, the Vivo V40 Pro's auto mode generally selects an appropriate ISO level, shutter speed, etc. to produce quite rich tones, especially if you leave it on that default vivid mode. Despite the pixel binning, my test shots were dense with finer details, so they look good even when you crop in. And when the lights are low, any motion does generally result in quite fuzzy, blurry pics, but the zoom still works pretty well. Not too much grain creeping in there either. But one of the undoubted highlights of the Vivo V40 Pro's camera is the portrait mode. Again, you've got an absolute plethora of options here, far too many to be honest, including various bokeh style effects. And also if you tap down here, you've got some suggested presets, including a bit of landscape portrait, street portrait, all at various focal lengths. You've actually got a choice of focal lengths down here as well, so 24 for a pulled back dramatic portrait. Got 50 mils, which is probably my favorite for getting a portrait without being right in your subject's face, all the way up to 100 mils, which zooms in quite far, but still gets you a nice crispy snap of your subject. And I was very happy with some of the results that I saw spaffed out by the V40 Pro. Captures some great looking snaps of your kids, your cats. And that portrait sensor is also pretty good for just generally zooming into a scene. Although you don't want to crop in much more than 4 times, because then things start to look a little bit, well, disturbing, really. As an example, this here Rolling Stones tribute band actually started to look like the Rolling Stones. As for that 50 meg ultra wide angle shooter, well again, this is perfectly fine for fitting more into frame. And for your video type shenanigans, the Vivo V40 Pro does max out at 4K resolution. There's no 8K option, but you can shoot 60 frames per second at Ultra HD. And last up, you may not get any googly goodness packed on here, but if you can stomach that, then the Huawei Nova 13 Pro is a charming wee smartphone with some particularly smart-ass camera tech. And what you've got here is a 50 megapixel primary shooter with optical image stabilization and also a variable aperture, just like the Pura 70 Ultra. You'll have to dive into the aperture mode in order to take advantage of that. As you can see, you've got a virtual aperture and also the physical aperture. 4 separate stages here, f1.4 all the way up to f4. And by tapping these, you can widen the aperture or make it nice and narrow as well, depending on how much bokeh action you want, and obviously the lighting conditions. So if you want a really nice portrait shot, for instance, you might want to swap down to f1.4. As you can see, just blurs the background nicely, helps your subject to stand out. In regular photo mode, doesn't look like you've got any aperture control. That's handled automatically on your behalf. As you can see there, you've also got an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle shooter, and unlike many mid-rangers, you also have yourself a 12 megapixel telephoto shooter with equivalent 3 times optical zoom. And here's an example of that telephoto shooter in action, again last night. Apologies, my hands weren't particularly steady after several Christmas shandies. And around the front end of the Huawei Nova 13 Pro, you've got yourself a 60 megapixel selfie shooter with autofocus. As you can see there, a bit of eye autofocus action. 60 meg, that's too many megs when you're feeling as bleary-eyed and haggard as me. But of course, this does use a bit of pixel binning, so thankfully you don't get a 60 megapixel image. It'll definitely have to be beauty mode to the extreme today, I think. And that second camera is an 8 megapixel portrait cam with a 2 times optical zoom. Even closer to the action, excellent. And this is why you shouldn't drink, kiddies. And there you have it, my lovelies. That is your Uncle Spurt's pick of the best mid-range camera phones you can bag yourself in early 2025. Now, did I miss out your own personal favourite? Well, definitely clue me in as to what a massive bald knobber I am down in the comments below. Let us know what your choice would have been. In the meantime, I've unboxed and reviewed basically all of these smartphones right here on TechSperts. Go check out those videos if any of them has particularly tickled your fancy, so to speak. Please do poke, subscribe and ding that notifications bell for more on the latest and greatest tech. Plenty of mid-range shenanigans on its way, including a bit of Nothing Phone 3A, Pixel 9a hopefully in March as well, and of course a fresh new iPhone SE. Way. Make sure you have yourselves a bloody wonderful rest of the week. Cheers everyone. Love you.